original theoretical paper. I intend to more than likely turn this into a dissertation later on, but right now I'm really just sort of conceptualizing how emotional labor functions in higher education, particularly focusing on the experiences of Black and Latinx women. So first, I sort of want to just define emotional labor. I feel it's sort of becoming like a trendy word a lot of folks have heard, or maybe not heard it, and sort of the ways in which I'm using it, at least for my paper. So really thinking about feeling rules that are racialized and gendered and provide constraints for the avenues of emotional expression that folks have. Emotional labor really sort of breaks down into two sort of components. One is emotion work, which is just sort of the work of managing your own emotions. And folks do that all the time with their families, with their friends, in their private life. But when it's tied to capital, when it's tied to work, then we call it emotion labor because there's a way in which it functions in the marketplace and it's given value as a sort of larger labor that we could possibly tie sort of financial benefits to. And emotion labor was originally coined by sociologist Arlie Hochschild in 1979, I believe her first paper came out talking about emotion labor and emotion work. And she was really focusing on studying folks who work in service industries. So teachers, folks who work in department stores or who have sort of front-facing, customer-facing roles and have to manage their emotions a lot in the workplace. So I'm using two theoretical frameworks for my research. The first is CRT, and the second one, I think, critical race theory, that is really the most important that I ground my work in really is intersectionality. I use intersectionality because it helps to really explain how racism and sexism coexist, and they're not sort of like separate categorical systems of oppression, but they really reify each other in the ways in which, at least I'm conceptualizing my paper. And it's less about them occurring as single points of crossing, but rather really working as interlocking systems of oppression, right, where racism is sexed and sexism is raced, and so it's not helpful to talk about them separately. So within the sort of larger theoretical framework of intersectionality that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, she breaks out intersectionality into a couple of different types. And the one that I'm focusing on most is representational intersectionality, which really gets the idea of thinking about how folks are represented in larger media, or how stereotypes, biases, tropes about certain folks that are race and sex then determine how they're treated in different contexts. So an example of that that Crenshaw provides in her paper is thinking about Black women and their experiences in the legal system, and so ways in which their victimhood is challenged or questioned because they're not seen as victims, their ability to be raped or assaulted is questioned under the law because they sort of fall into this in-between category where we're not clearly classifying them as a person of color, and we're not clearly classifying them as women, thus they sort of get lost in the cracks. And so because of that, their sexuality and ways in which they're like hypersexed or hyper-policed when it comes to them not clearly fitting into what we sort of normalize as a person of color and default to as man, or a woman, which we default to as a white woman, and then they're again sort of lost in the in-between. So for my paper, I really focused on, like I said, Black and Latinx women, the experiences of both of them. I'm only going to share I'm going to sort of go in depth on the experiences of Black women, and for the sake of time, sort of condense a little bit the experiences of Latina women. So looking at how cultural and historical representations create that representational intersectionality that I referred to in the slide before, it's helpful to think about the caricature or the trope of the mammy, right? So this is an image that you can see a Black woman is actually feeding a white child, more like she was in slavery, from her actual breasts, right? We see Aunt Jemima on syrup in grocery stores still sort of has this image of the mammy, who's a sort of maternal caregiver whose greatest motivation was really to serve the children of their slave master, and to do so to basically to their detriment, right? So they gave of themselves body, mind, and spirit, and did so largely because of sort of what they were tasked with doing, but then it created this idea that Black women are naturally caregivers, are naturally going to be giving of themselves to an extent that is actually pretty dangerous and damaging to their self. An example of that we see sort of recently as well is thinking about how Black women function in politics. So the recent election of Doug Jones to the Alabama Senate happened largely because of Black women voters, right? And so there's this way in which Black women were then sort of praised and lauded for quote unquote saving America or saving Alabama. And we framed the narrative around their polling as if they voted in a way that they did to save America rather than to save themselves, right? That they were acting in the best interest of others rather than acting in their own self-interest. And so then you get these sort of things about how strong they are, how selfless they are, and how they sort of work in ways that benefit everyone, and yet aren't really sort of given resources, given access to the political sphere to then run things, right? Sort of manipulated and used to fit a narrative of sort of selfless mammy again, and it's functioning, I argue, in politics in this way. Yeah, so one other thing I wanted to note is that sort of the way in which the mammy in politics, I think, is gendered for sure, but then also racialized as we think about white women and how they sort of were voting pretty consistently for Rory Moore, even though exit polling showed a slight majority of all voters believe that his allegations of sexual misconduct were definitely or probably true, right? So ways in which other folks very clearly vote against their own self-interest, and then Black women are sort of opposite that point. So really quickly talking about Latinx women and the way in which they also have these cultural, historical representations that mark them in ways that are different than how Black women are marked, but then still lend itself to this emotional labor that's being performed, is really thinking about this second bullet point here, which is the faithful or self-sacrificing señorita, the idea that Latina women are faithful and will, give of themselves and, again, sacrifice themselves for a love interest, to uphold patriarchy, to demonstrate that they have cast off their old sort of ways of whether it be like cultural or religious ways, to prove that they have sort of shifted their allegiances towards sort of whiteness, and in a lot of cases towards a love interest, right? So another example of how it's sort of operating in a different sphere is media, right? So we have the stereotype of the spicy Latinas, or the TV show Nannies and Maids, which was lauded and given a lot of praise because it was sort of the first time in mainstream television there was a cast of characters that were exclusively Latina, and there were strong women and strong characters. The fact that this got greenlit because they were also maids, right? Because they also served, because they also performed labor for other folks. So even though their storylines really disrupted some of that and showed how strong they were, on face value, it's still upholding a stereotype of someone who's working in service to someone else, working to clean up someone else's mess, and falling into those, redefining those cultural and historical stereotypes. So how this, I think, operates in higher education is really through, in part, service work. So universities are over-reliant on women faculty and faculty of color to serve as diversity representatives on committees, right? So this idea that when you have a lived experience, you must know what we need to do to improve our institutions, to improve climate. Thus, we're asking you to perform service work that at times is unvalued, unpaid, doesn't necessarily help folks progress in their careers. And those expectations aren't the same for men, they aren't the same for white women. And so there's this commodification of Black and Latinx women that's happening in service work. There's this idea that Black women have, and Latinx women have not only the capacity, but almost the obligation and willingness to take on the burdens of others. And women faculty and faculty of color are overrepresented in this work that's least valued, right, when it comes to the types of service work that faculty perform. And so am I looking at this for graduate students, and thinking about how we socialize graduate students to become faculty, it's really starting at the graduate student level. The ways in which graduate students also participate in service work are also socialized around what types of activities they should be investing in. Is those images or this messaging is coming at the graduate level. So aside from wanting to just acknowledge that emotional labor is being performed by Black and Latinx women, that it's being performed in ways that benefit higher education and institutions, it's being performed in ways that could be exploitative. There's also a flip side of this where there's agency, and that's sort of where I want to shift to and talk about next. So thinking about emotional labor being performed as a mechanism for collective community care. Patricia Williams outlines the importance of agency in developing strategies for resistance. And so she has a quote that says, in thinking about our legal and political system, words like freedom and choice are forms of currency. So the choice and the freedom, to some extent, that Black and Latinx women have to opt in to performing emotion labor, the choices that they have to perform it for not only others that the institution is asking them to perform for, so whether that's undergraduate students or colleagues, but then also performing it for themselves and creating collective communities wherein they perform emotion labor as a way to create counter spaces, right? So the idea being that these women create collective communities of care so that if they're in a predominantly white department or a department that's otherwise marginalizing, they have opportunities to find community across campus, across departments, and do care for one another in ways in which their department is not. A counter space in this way serves as a space that can be physical, intellectual, or in this case emotional, allows for the validation of their lived experience, collective critique of these harmful stereotypes of the cultural and historical representation of them, and it challenges assumptions and deficit perspectives of Black and Latinx women in higher education. So the last part that I want to leave you all with is this quote from Harsha Valia in her book called Undoing Border Imperialism. I think it's really powerful, and it sort of captures the way in which I'm starting to frame this conceptual work. It's women of color solidarities are based on the recognition that since the subjectivities of women of color are the most impacted by systems of oppression and exploitation, we embody the pathways necessary to concurrently disrupt multiple layers of injustice.